hello, and welcome to the archives. Today, because of the announcement not that long ago that Fantasy Flight Games is putting out a Core 2.0 set, and I've been looking at and comparing some of the cards and the lists and whatnot that have been kicking around. I thought it would be fun to actually take a look and see exactly what has changed. So we're going to do that. I'm going to pop up the before and the after, basically the Core 1.0 and the Core 2.0 list for each faction as we're talking here, so you guys can follow along as well. Pardon me. My throat is a little bit scratchy today. I may have to take a drink now and then. But let's get into it here. So here we have the Anarch cards for Core 1.0 on the left and Core 2.0 on the right. And already we can see some differences. And from what I understand, any cards that are in the original core set that are not in the second core set, when the second core set is released, those cards that aren't there anymore will no longer be valid for tournament play. I do believe so. So first off, we have the identity. Noise is the identity in the original. In 2.0, it's Reina Roja, which I was extremely happy about because she was one of the ones that was cycling out. So we've got a completely different Anarch now. We have, let's see here. Do they have it in this one? No, they don't. No, they don't. Deja Vu. The event. 2 cards of it in the core, the original core, and there is none in the new core. So Deja Vu is going away. That's the one that lets the runner pull cards from their heap and put them back into their hand. Interesting choice to cut back on recursion. Very interesting. Demolition Run is an event. There was 3 copies of that in the original core. There's only 2 copies of it in 2.0. Stim Hack was an event, 3 copies of it. It is still an event in 2.0, but there's only 1 copy of it. Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. We have Grimoire is the hardware console for the Anarch in this one, and it has been replaced with Spinal Modem. There's only 1 copy of the console in the original core, Grimoire. No copies of it in the new one, but we have 2 copies of Cyber Feeder. Oh wait, no, Cyber Feeder isn't. No, Spinal Modem. Spinal Modem is the one I'm talking about. There's 2 copies of that. Very interesting that they would include 2. Cyber Feeder was, of course, another hardware. 3 copies of that in the original core, down to 2 copies. They're spreading cards out a lot more, I find, so far. Corroder was our barrier breaker in core, one of the better ones. 2 copies of that in the original core. No copies of uh, Corroder in this one. So Corroder's going away. Let's see, Data Sucker. 2 copies of that in the original. The same in the new one. Jin. 2 copies of Jin. No copies of Jin in this one. So Jin's going away. Medium. There was 2 copies of Medium. That was the one that every time you make a successful run on R&D, you put a virus counter on it, and for every virus counter on it over the first, you could access an additional card from R&D, which allowed for some deep digs into R&D. But there is no copy of Medium in the new core. That's going away. Huh. Very, very interesting that they would get rid of that. I'm a fan of that myself. Because a lot of... I mean, there were decks that were completely built around locking down R&D and just running R&D until you win. Which makes it pointless for the Corp to start building up other servers, because if they start building up other servers to put an agenda in to score it, then the runner could just, come in, trash that server, and just keep hammering R&D. It made for a very oppressive play style from the Corp point of view. I think this is going to shake things up. We've got Mimic, which is your Sentry Breaker. 2 copies of that. And in the new core, it's up to 3 copies. Parasite was a program that could trash a piece of ice. You'd stick it on, it would slowly accumulate virus counters until lowering the strength of the ice it was on until it got to 0, and then it would trash it. But with certain other programs, it would cause difficulties. There was 3 copies of that in the original core, and there is no copies of it in the new core. So they're getting rid of Parasite entirely. Data Sucker, I forgot to cover that one. Data Sucker was 2 copies of it, and 2 copies of it in the new one too. That's the one that would get virus counters, and you could spend them to lower the strength of the ice. So if you had enough power counters on Data Sucker, and the Corp hadn't purged them, you could just install a Parasite on something and just go spend virus counters, lower the strength to 0, the ice would be trashed immediately. Which, again, could cause some trouble. Let's see, Worm is a program, 2 copies of it, and there's no Worm in the new one. Wow. Yogg.0 was your Code Gate Breaker. 2 copies of that. No copies of Yogg in the new one. You had Ice Carver was a resource. 1 copy of that. That's the same in the new one. And then Wildside. 2 copies of Wildside. But there's no Wildside in this one either. Holy heck. So, they've gotten rid of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cards of the Anarchs plus the identity noise. 9 cards gone from the Anarchs from core set. But they have been replaced. We have, in the new one, we have 2 copies of Retrieval Run. We have 1 copy of Singularity. Let's see, Spinal Modem, as I said. We've got 2 copies of Darwin. We've got 3 copies of Force of Nature. 1 copy of Imp. 1 copy of Hemorrhage. We've got 3 copies of Morningstar, 3 copies of Liberated Account, 2 copies of Scrubber, and 1 copy of Xanadu, all in the core set. So a lot of those cards were in, I think, the first or second cycle of data packs that was released. And these are ones that are sticking around now, because Reina Roja was in the second cycle, and she's now sticking around. I'm kind of sad to see that there's no Kaisa Ice in here, but because they're keeping Reina around, it makes me wonder, and I think, I'm calling it now, I think we're going to see some Kaisa 2.0 programs, which will be much more capable of causing trouble. Alright, here we have the criminal cards. Now, you'll notice that Gabriel Santiago was our identity in the original core and is still the identity in the new core. We also have, let's see, Easy Mark was an event. Oh, let's go to the top one, actually. I almost forgot that. Account Siphon. Glorious Account Siphon that so many runners have used to keep the court poor. Not anymore, because there was 2 copies of it in the original, no copies of it in the new one. No more Account Siphon. There was a card I remember, I can't remember the name of it now. I covered it in the last episode of Archives, I believe, where I looked at the last data pack in the Red Sand cycle. And there was a card in there that was a lot like Account Siphon. It was for Anarchs, and it removed itself from the game after you played it. So there's still a way to do that, but you only get so many kicks at the can with it, because it then removes itself. So I'm kind of liking that. Easy Mark had 3 copies of it, and there's still 3 copies of it in the new one. Forged Activation Orders had 3 copies in the original, has 2 copies in the new core. Inside Job had 3 copies, only 2 copies in the new. Special Order had 3 copies, down to 1 copy in the new core. Very interesting. There's also the fact that the new core also has Emergency Shutdown. 2 copies of that. That's one from, I believe, the first 2 cycles as well. Our console for Criminal was Desperado. And it was pretty broken, a lot of people have thought. It is replaced with Doppelganger. 2 copies of. Lemuria Codecracker was hardware, which let you expose a card for money. Was 2 copies of in the original core. It is not in the new. Instead, we have HQ Interface, 1 copy. HQ Interface is the one that gives you an extra access. You can access an additional card in HQ. We have Aurora for our programs. Was 2 copies of. I believe Aurora is a barrier breaker. I believe so. Yes, because I think, okay, yes. Aurora is a barrier breaker. 2 copies of. There's 3 copies of it in the new core. Femme Fatale had 2 copies of that, and there is still 2 copies of it. However, there is an additional 3 copies of Fairy, which are Sentry Breakers. I believe Fairy and Femme Fatale are a Sentry Breaker. Possibly. Although Femme Fatale just might be any ice as well. But 3 copies of Fairy, it's pretty good. Ninja is two credits, or two copies of, I should say. But there is no Ninja. We're losing Ninja. So that's kind of interesting. That might be why they have copies of Fairy, because Ninja, I think, is also a Sentry breaker. Yeah, that might be why. And there's 3 copies of Peacock, which is a code gate breaker, I believe, in the new one. As well as 1 copy of Pheromones, which is a program that is helpful. I can't remember what it does offhand, but it's a helpful program. And the original 2 copies of Sneak Door Beta has been replaced by 1 copy of Sneak Door Beta. So, kind of interesting. Kind of interesting. We have Bank Job, 2 copies of in the original, the same in Core 2.0. Crash Base has 2 copies, the same in 2.0. Data Dealer has 1 copy in the original, no copies in the new. And Decoy has 2 copies in the original, no copies in the new. Very interesting. Instead, the new core has 1 copy of Fall Guy and 1 copy of Mr. Lee. Very, very interesting. Yeah, I can dig it. All right. Let me just have a quick look here first. Let's see. We're losing Account Siphon. So that's 1. We are losing Desperado and Lemuria Codecracker. We are losing Ninja and Data Dealer and Decoy. So 6 different cards plus Gabriel. Oh, no, not plus Gabriel, because we're keeping Gabriel. 6 different cards from the criminals. So far, Anarchs are taking a big hit. Okay. Now, we're going to go and have a look at the Shapers. All right. Now, in the original, we had Kate Mac McCaffrey as our Shaper identity. She has been replaced with Chaos Theory, which I'm both happy about and sad, because I kind of liked Kate. Kate was pretty cool. Nobody thought Kate was going anywhere, but she is. It's a possibility they may have decided to take Kate out because they've taken prepaid voice pads off of the MWL, and I know there was a whole deck with prepaid Kate, so I don't know. But let's have a look and see what cards are actually disappearing. We've got Diesel, had 3 copies. Diesel gives you flames. 3 copies in the original, only 2 in the new. Modded, 2 copies in the original, 3 copies in the new. Oh, very interesting. A full playset of Modded in the new core. I can dig that. The Maker's Eye, 3 copies of that in the original core, down to 1 copy in the new. And then you have Tinkering, 3 copies in the original, down to 2 in the new. But we have some other events that have been included. We've got 2 copies of Indexing that's been added in the new core, as well as 1 copy of Notoriety. Not a full playset, but still, 1 copy is nothing to sneeze at. I can kind of understand why they only have the one copy of Notoriety, because otherwise they're going to have people making shapers that can just break through all the centrals and going spending a turn running on all three and getting an agenda point and doing that 3 times. Let's see. And Test Run. 2 copies of Test Run as well, which is one of Chaos Theory's cards. So we went from having, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 events spread over just 4 different types of events to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We got 13 events spread over 7 different types. So much more variety with the events. Not everything just condensed together. The toolbox was our hardware. A pretty hefty cost, but a pretty decent console. Only 1 copy of that. That has been replaced with Dinosaurus. 2 copies of it. Where we had Akamatsu Memchip, there was 2 copies of that. No more. No more Akamatsu Memchip after the new core hits. Instead, we've got... do we have? No, we don't. There is no Memchip in here. I thought there was. I guess not. We've got the Rabbit Hole. There was 2 copies of Rabbit Hole. There are still 2 copies of Rabbit Hole in the new core. And the Personal Touch had 2 copies. It's down to 1 copy. Now, over on the program side of things, Battering Ram had 2 copies of it. Now up to 3 copies of Battering Ram. Gordian Blade had 3 copies, and Gordian Blade still has 3 copies. Magnum Opus had 2 copies, and it still has 2 copies. Not going to get rid of the Mopus. Mopus was the best. Pipeline had 2 copies of it. It is now up to 3 copies. But NetShield. There was 2 copies of NetShield originally, but not anymore. That is now gone. Aesop's Pawn Shop was the resource 1 copy of. Still got 1 copy of Aesop's Pawn Shop in the new. Sacrificial Construct had 2 copies of it. It's down to 1 copy in the new core. And we get 1 copy of All Nighter in the new core as well. So, for cards that have disappeared, we've got Bip Bip, the Toolbox, and Akamatsu Memchip, and NetShield, as well as Kate. So Shaper wasn't hit really a lot. All the cards that were in the core are mostly still in the core, but now we've got a bunch of new cards that have been added. And the amounts changed to make room for that. Not bad. Not bad at all. Shapers are doing quite well, from what I understand. There we go. And now we're going to go and take a look at the neutral cards. Alright. Now on the new here, there's 2 things labeled Game Aid. We don't need to worry about them. We've got Infiltration. An event, 3 copies of that in the original core. Only 2 copies of it in the new. Sure Gamble, 3 copies of it in the original, 3 copies of Sure Gamble in the new. access to GlobalSec, hardware, 3 copies in the original, no copies in the new. Oh, absolutely no copies of it in the new. No more access to GlobalSec. Very interesting. Instead, it has been replaced with Dyson MemChip. 3 copies of that hardware. I guess since they got rid of Akamatsu, they got Dyson now. All right. Crypsis. 3 copies of Crypsis, down to 2 copies of Crypsis in the new. Armitage Code Busting, we had 3 copies of. There's still 3 copies of in the new. And instead, we've also got 2 copies of Underworld Contact in the new core, which was never in the old. That is interesting. Huh. I can dig this. So that's it for the runner cards. Instead of doing this in 2 episodes, I'm going to power through and we're going to go and take a look at the others. So let us just go and have a little look-see. Okay, now let's move on to the corp cards. Here we have Hosp Bioroid, the original and the new. And there's been some changes here. Originally, the Hosp Bioroid identity was Engineering the Future, I believe, where I believe you would gain a credit the first time you installed something. I believe. Instead, we are now using Stronger Together, which is a much more recent Hosp Bioroid identity. No, it's not more recent. Stronger Together was the second Hosp Bioroid identity, where all Bioroids have +1 strength. Yes. That is the identity that we have now for the core Hosp Bioroid. Accelerated Beta Test is the agenda. 3 copies of. It is no longer in the core set for the new. And instead of just 3 agenda points, we now have 5 different agenda, or 3 agenda cards. We have 5 agenda cards. 2 copies of Project Ares, and 3 copies of Project Vitruvius, giving a much more broader area for the runner to use when using a core. Let's see. The Adonis campaign, 3 copies of in the original, 3 copies of in the new. So Adonis is sticking around. Good to know. Aggressive Secretary, 2 copies of that in the old, 1 copy in the new core. Heimdall 1.0 was an ice, 2 copies of in the original, 1 copy in the new. We also get Hudson 1.0, 1 copy in the new, which wasn't in the original. Ichi 1.0 had 3 copies of in the original. It's down to 2 copies. Rototurret had 2 copies and maintains at 2. Victor 1.0 had 2 copies of. It is now up to 3 copies. So a fair bit of Bioroids. Pretty cool. I kind of like the spread overall of those. We've already covered the identity. Archive Memories Operation. 2 copies of in the original. Only 1 in the new. Bodic Labor was 3 copies of in the original. Down to 2 now. We also get 3 copies of Green Level Clearance in the new core, which was not in the original core. That was in one of the first 2 cycles, I believe. Shipment from Mirror Morph had 2 copies of in the original, down to 1 now in the new. And Corporate Troubleshooter had 1 copy of, and Experiential Data had 2 copies of in the original. Both of those cards are not in the new core, which is interesting indeed. Instead, we have Ash 2X3ZB9CY, 1 copy of, and Strongbox, 1 copy of. Which is an interesting way. Ash was a fun card, and I know a lot of people were kind of sad that he was going to be cycling out. But now he is not. People can be happy again. Alright, let's move on to the next and have a look at Jinteki. Now here we have the Jinteki identity, which was personal evolution. That core identity remains the same. We had 3 copies of Nisei Mark II for the agenda in the original core. That is down to 2 copies of it in the new core. However, they have added 3 copies of Brain Trust. So Brain Trust isn't going anywhere. And Brain Trust is a fun little agenda card in that if you over advance it, it lowers the cost of all your ice by 1, I think, for every 2 advancement tokens over 3. So if you over advance it to 5, all your ice is lowered by 1. If you over advance it to 7, all your ice is lowered by 2. Pretty cool. I'm glad to see that sticking around. Project Junebug was an asset ambush, 3 copies of in the original, down to 2 in the new core. But that's okay. I'm a fan of Project Junebug. Snare had 3 copies of in the original. It is down to 2 in the new. Zaibatsu Loyalty had 1 copy of. It is not in the new core. Instead, we have a copy of Ronin, which is also an asset that can do net damage. Ice, let's have a look. Cell Portal, 2 copies of in the original. No copies of it in the new. That's surprising. No more Cell Portal. Chum, 2 copies of in the original. And no copies of in the new. So Chum is gone. Datamine had 2 copies of in the original. And no copies of in the new. Oh, Jinteki is losing one of their trap ice. Oh, wow. That is something I didn't know. So already we've lost 6 copies of 3, or 2 copies each of 3 pieces of ice. Neural Katana goes down to, or has 3 copies in the original, and it is down to 1 in the new core. Wall of Thorns had 3 copies of in the original. It's down to 1 in the new. Interesting. But instead of the ones that we've lost, we're getting Himitsubako, 3 copies of. Swordsman, 2 copies of that. Whirlpool, 1 copy of that. And Yagura, 1 copy of that. So, some interesting choices for ice there. Definitely, Whirlpool is still a trap, preventing the runner from jacking out. Huh. Very interesting. Neural EMP was an operation we had 2 copies of in the original, 2 copies of in the new. Precognition was 2 copies of in the original, no copies of in the new. We're losing Precognition. And Akitaro Watanabe was an upgrade for 1 copy of, and he is not in the new core either. Instead, however, We are getting 3 copies of Celebrity Gift, which is good, more money for Jinteki. 2 copies of Trick of the Light, also a really good card. I'm glad we're not losing that. And 1 copy of Hokusai Grid, also a good upgrade. Some interesting choices here for Jinteki. So we're losing, what is it? Zaibatsu Loyalty, Cell Portal, Chum, Data Mine, Precognition, and Akitara Watanabe. We're losing 6 cards from Jinteki, but getting some really good cards as well. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's take a look at the next. NBN. Now, NBN originally had AstroScript pilot program for the agenda. Wait, the NBN identity was making news. 2 extra credits recurring to spend using traces. That's the same. It had AstroScript pilot program as an agenda. It had 2 copies of that in the original, and 2 copies of breaking news agenda in the original. Instead, in the new core, because we're losing both of those agendas, AstroScript pilot program was put on the most wanted list and limited down to 1 per deck because of how much of a good card it was and how easily it could be abused for fast advance. Breaking news was one that would give a tag to the runner for the remainder of the corpse turn, which could be troublesome. It could be used to pull off some truly brutal combos that the runner had no way of getting out of. So both of those agendas are now gone. Instead, we have Project Bialy, or Beal, 3 copies of it, and 3 copies of TGTBT. Huh. Very, very interesting. So NBN goes from 4 agendas up to 6. So everybody's been getting 2 more agendas added to what they normally have. Not bad. Ghost Branch had 3 copies of in the original, down to 1 in the new. Data Raven, 3 copies of in the original, down to 2 in the new core. Matrix Analyzer had 3 copies of in the original, and it doesn't have any in the new. Interesting, we're losing Matrix Analyzer. NBN had Toll Booth, 3 copies of in the original, down to 2 in the new core. And that was all the ice for NBN. But now, so NBN had 9 pieces of ice that was all their own in the old core. And now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the new. So we've got an extra piece of ice, and the amounts are spread out more. Because we have 1 copy of Flare in the new core, 3 copies of Pop-Up Window in the new core, and 2 copies of Wraparound in the new core. All really good pieces of ice. Anonymous Tip, 2 copies of in the original, down to 1 in the new. 2 copies of Closed Accounts in the original. That's the same in the new core. 2 copies of Psychographics in the original. Up to 3 copies of in the new. I'm happy with this. Psychographics is a good card. C-Source, or SEA Source. 2 copies in the original. 2 copies in the new. Red Herrings was an upgrade. 2 copies in the original, down to 1 in the new. And San City Grid was an upgrade. 1 copy in the original, no copies of in the new. We're losing San City Grid. Instead, we're getting Bernice Mai. One copy of her. So, San City Grid and Matrix Analyzer, Breaking News and AstroScript Pilot Program, we are losing for NBN. And 3 of those, the AstroScript Pilot Program, Breaking News, and San City Grid, were all rather heavily used cards. Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Okay. Now we will go and take a look at Wayland Consortium. All right. Now, I believe Building a Better World, the Wayland identity, is the same as the original core identity as well. I will double check that if you will give me just a second and a half while I go and take a peek. We'll scroll on down to Wayland Consortium, Building a Better World, gain 1 whenever you play a transaction operation. And that should be the same in the revised. Yep, it is the same. Okay. So we know that only Haas Bayreuth has a new identity out of the corpse. What do we have for agendas? Well, we had 3 copies of Hostile Takeover in the original and 2 copies of Posted Bounty. So Wayland started with 5, had 5 agenda points to begin with in its, or 5 different agendas that it could use in the original core. Instead, in the new core, we're going to have 1 copy of Hostile Takeover, 3 copies of Project Atlas, and 1 copy of the Cleaners. Posted Bounty will no longer be an agenda. It will be gone. We had 1 copy of Security Subcontract in the original, and that is now gone. Instead, it has been replaced with 1 copy of Dedicated Response Team, 1 copy of Elizabeth Mills, and 3 copies of Grendel Refinery as assets. Grendel Refinery is good for money making. I'm quite a fan of Grendel Refinery. Very interesting. ICE. We've got 2 copies of Archer. There's only 1 copy of Archer in the new core, however. Hadrian's Wall had 2 copies in the original, down to 1 copy in the new. Ice Wall had 3 copies of in the original. It's down to 2 in the new. And Shadow had 3 copies of in the original, and it's down to 2 in the new. However, we also get 2 copies of Caduceus and 2 copies of Hive. So we're not losing any ice from Wayland. We're gaining a couple more in the core. So that's not bad. That's not bad at all. We have Operations. Aggressive Negotiation, 2 copies of in the original core. And there isn't any in the new. Aggressive Negotiation is gone. 3 copies of Beanstalk Royalties in the old core, and 3 copies of it in the new core. Scorched Earth had 2 copies in the original. It's gone in the new. Shipment from Kaguya had 2 copies in the original, 2 copies in the new. And we've also got a replacement, I think, for possibly Scorched Earth. Punitive Counter-Strike, 2 copies of in the new. Now, we had 2 copies of an upgrade research station in the old core. That's not in the new. So research station is now gone. So posted bounty, security subcontract, aggressive negotiation, scorched earth, and research station all gone from Wayland. But we're getting some better cards in here. A Hive is a really good piece of ice for early game. Caduceus is amazing. Because it can do, there's a trace on it that gives the runner 3 credits if it goes through, and if the runner is strapped for cash, or gives the corp, I should say, 3 credits. If the runner's strapped for cash, they'll just be like, nope, the runner can just let that fire. So yeah, really interesting. All right, lastly, but not leastly, let's go take a look at the neutral cards for the Corp. All right. Now, in the original core set, there was 3 copies of Priority Requisition and 3 copies of Private Security Force for agendas. In the new Corp, or the new core, we have 1 copy of False Lead, 2 copies of Priority Requisition, and 2 copies of Private Security Force. So it's gone down in terms of how many agendas you get in a neutral, but it's gone up in how many agendas you can have in your faction. I'm for that. That's pretty cool. Melange Mining Corp had 2 copies of in the original, still got 2 in the new. The click tracker and the corp actions are just game aids. We're not going to worry about them. Ooh, hello. I think that is a misprint. They have Pad Campaign down here as an upgrade. It was an asset. 3 copies of it. 3 copies of Pad Campaign in the original. 3 copies in the new. That's the same. Enigma, 3 copies of in the original. 3 copies in the new. Hunter, 2 copies in the original. 2 copies in the new. Wall of Static, 3 copies in the original, 3 copies in the new. And Hedge Fund, 3 copies in the original, 3 copies in the new. So they kept a lot of those the same, your assets, your operation, and the neutral ice, because they were all good, decent ice. There wasn't really a need to change them. The addition of False Lead is interesting, and the lessening of how many priority requisitions and private security forces, that's also interesting. I think, like, I've heard a lot of the people in my local gaming store saying that it's a lot more balanced, the new core 2.0 over the old core. And I think that's true. And I'm not sure, but I've been noticing as I've been comparing these that there is, like, for example, where was it? We were looking at it here. Yeah, we'll go have a peek back here at NBN. There was, let's see, Anonymous Tip or Red Herrings, for example. Both of those had 2 copies in the original core set, but only 1 in the new. So if somebody had bought the original core and now bought the new core, they would have a full playset. I don't know if that was their intent, but it makes me wonder if, and that's a question I'm curious about, will the old core cards, the old core set cards, be still valid as long as they're in the new core set? Or will there be like new art on the cards in the new core to differentiate? So you will need to buy multiple core 2.0 to get a full playset of these new cards. Would you be able to use the old core cards, even if the art is different, as long as the abilities were exactly the same and the influence costs and all that. I don't know if they're going to be making any big changes in terms of art or whatnot. Um, I would hope not, because then you could use some of the original core as well to supplement, um, or even use some of the cards from the data packs as well to supplement if need be. So I don't know how that's going to go, but we will have to wait and see. But I am excited for this new core, um, most definitely, and not only because Reina Roja is in it. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Um, I hope I've helped shed a little light on things, and it's definitely an interesting breakdown in terms of how the cards are going to be popping up. Definitely interested to see what comes next. Uh, so yeah, thank you all so much for watching. As always, if you like what I'm doing, please give that like button a tap. Give that subscribe button a tap as well if you haven't already, so you can be kept apprised of when I do new videos. And throw a comment in the comment section. What do you think about Core 2.0? What do you think is going to be happening? Do you think they're going to be releasing Kaisa 2.0 ice that's going to be beefier and bigger and badder and able to really, really tear into the corpse? I hope so. I certainly hope so. It would make my day. So do all that, and until next time, my friends, remember, keep running.